Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with Danielle Barondess, one of the creators of Law Clerks for Diversity. Your Law School Toolbox host today is Alison Monahan, and typically I'm with Lee Burgess. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so that you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. Together with the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. I also run the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can always reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we would love to hear from you. With that, let's get started. Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with Danielle Barondess, one of the creators of Law Clerks for Diversity. So welcome, Danielle.
Hi, Alison. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Well, to start us off, could you just talk a little bit about Law Clerks for Diversity? What is this?
So Law Clerks for Diversity is a sort of new initiative that I'm working on with another law clerk, Stephen Arango. And we are sort of thinking about ways that we can improve the diversity problem in the federal judiciary, starting with law clerks. So the idea is to sort of first and foremost create a mentorship program where law students and recent graduates can connect with current and former law clerks and talk with them about strategies for obtaining a clerkship, get contacts to expand their network so that they have other a wider net sort of to reach from if they're at a school that may not have as much alumni who participate in clerkships. So we sort of see the program being first and foremost a mentorship program, and then having sort of other elements like sort of a broad clerkship bank where you can again contact current and former clerks of judges that you might end up getting an interview with, a cover letter and a resume bank, input on what types of writing samples for clerkship applications, which can be sort of unique. Eventually, we see sort of panels, webinars, things like that, all sort of focused on the eventual goal of helping more diverse candidates land federal clerkships.
And when we say diversity, what are the kind of things you're thinking about there?
So we're thinking of it sort of in kind of two buckets. So the first is sort of diversity in the more traditional sense of the word, as most of us probably think about it. Race, sex, gender, LGBTQ, socioeconomic status, disability status, things like that. And then the second bucket is sort of academic or school diversity. So the two sort of go hand in hand, but what I mean by school diversity is basically, these schools that are not the traditional sort of clerkship feeder schools. So not your typical, T14 schools that are often the ones that are putting the most resources into students in federal clerkships, the ones who are often sort of targeted and sort of benefit the most from the clerkship hiring process as it exists today. So we sort of see a space for those of us who went to non-T14 schools. And, to sort of wrap that back into the more traditional definition of diversity, that the fact is that the sort of pool of candidates in the lower ranked schools is going to be more diverse than, the pool of candidates in the T14 or the top 5 schools. Mm-hmm. So those are sort of the two sort of areas we're thinking about pretty broadly. So.
All right, great. And Stephen, actually, who you mentioned, was on an earlier podcast talking about some of this, so we will link to that in the show notes if people want to hear his perspective. All right, great. So now that we have kind of an understanding of what this is about, could you just give us an overview of your own background for context?
Sure. So I am just hit the 1-year mark in my current federal clerkship. I'm clerking at the district court in Hawaii, and I... next year, in 2021, we'll start a clerkship with a judge on the Ninth Circuit. So I'm doing about a 2-year district court clerkship and then a 1 year at the Ninth Circuit. So how I got here, I am from Northern Virginia, have been in there my entire life. I went to college in Virginia. I worked for a few years at a law firm as a paralegal in between undergrad and law school. I ended up going to law school in Virginia as well. Did my 3 years at George Mason School of Law in Arlington, Virginia. And then after that, I joined Wiley Ryan, which is a large firm in D.C., and I worked for a few years there before coming out here to Hawaii to clerk. So sort of to expand a little bit on kind of how I ended up, leading the firm life to clerk, I when I went to law school, I don't come from a family of lawyers, so I didn't really have any clerking wasn't really in my sort of long-term goal. I didn't really know what it was. I didn't really think about it. Nobody really told me right away. So by the time I heard about it, it was sort of, too late, or so I thought, to apply. So I sort of put that off for a little bit and joined the firm. And eventually I decided that clerking was something that I really wanted to experience. I love litigation, and I knew that that's sort of the path I wanted to take, and I really enjoyed appellate work as well. So I wanted to experience basically both, from behind the curtain, so to speak. So I started applying as a graduate, which is a little bit more unique, but becoming increasingly more common. And I found myself leaving the DC area for the first time in my 30 years of life, and moved out here to Hawaii to clerk. So
sounds like you picked a nice place to change to.
That's right. I cannot complain, that's for sure.
Well, you alluded to some of these, I think, a little bit in your story, but what kind of challenges do you think more diverse clerkship candidates face?
So, I think there are a lot of sort of particularly unique barriers that diverse students face. So I think partially to blame is sort of a disparity in access to resources and a sort of broad, strong network. So, clerkship applications are sort of overwhelming for even the best students at top schools with endless resources, and it's just particularly daunting for students who may not have family members who can talk to them about what the process is like, or have a large network of alum from their law school to mentor them and give them guidance on the process. And sort of on a similar point is the problem that many diverse students may not appreciate the value of a clerkship when they start law school. If they're anything like us, they might not know what a clerkship is at all, or what the value of it is. And this is, I think, particularly so for first-generation law students who, again, don't come from a long line of lawyers in their families. And it takes sort of someone reaching out and saying, "Hey, have you ever thought about clerking?" To sort of allow all that to line up. Or they may end up like me, and by the time they learn about the importance of a clerkship, they sort of think it must be too late. But as I mentioned earlier, I hope people understand that it's not, and there's no specific timeline that you have to follow. Another factor, I think all of us have experienced sort of to one degree or another an imposter syndrome. I think minorities and students from other diverse or the non-traditional backgrounds might be sort of, underselling themselves, or just deciding not to pursue a clerkship because they don't sort of see themselves represented anyway. And then sort of lastly is sort of the problem that the clerkship hiring process generally tends to favor just a more, a smaller subset of schools that have a smaller pool of diverse applicants. So I think, tying it back into this program, I think a lot of those barriers we want to expressly address with Law Clerks for Diversity, and, starting with sort of the basic idea that having a mentor or having a contact or having someone to give you sort of some insight into the process can just be so valuable.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I went to one of those fancy schools, and there's definitely, here's the clerkship office, and, here's the person who's going to help you with this, and here's the timeline, and here's how you do this. And, the law review had a whole book where it's like, oh, I've got an interview with this judge. What should I look at? What should we talk about? And, I think that's not necessarily fair.
Right.
But it's kind of, it is what it is. One thing I want to follow up on, so you mentioned a couple of times the value of a clerkship. If people are listening to this and they're just not really clear, like, that this does have value, what do you see as the value of the clerkship?
So I think there are sort of a lot of aspects to how a clerkship can be sort of a great life experience and something positive and helpful on your resume. So, for better or worse, they're sort of seen as this kind of gateway into many elite legal jobs. And so a clerkship is never going to negatively impact you. It's going to usually be something that looks positive on your resume. It's sort of a sign of 1 year at least of sort of intensive legal writing and research and just that sort of experience, sort of honing those skills, which we all know are important to being a lawyer. So sort of that's one aspect. Another is, you gain sort of a lifelong mentor. You work very closely with a judge, and you sort of spend every day for that year sort of working with that judge and learning his or her style and thinking about cases and thinking about hard questions that, end up in court. So those sort of skills are going to be things that I think obviously are going to help anyone who intends to practice law. So that's sort of one aspect. Another is, more practically speaking, is clerkships can be a good transition point to getting more into litigation or getting into appellate. So sometimes, because we're also overwhelmed in the law school and playing the law school game, basically, you might end up doing one thing when you graduate law school and think, oh, well, I really miss the writing aspect that I had in law school, which I'm not getting as much here. So clerking can also be sort of a good positive way to transition into something more litigation-based or something more sort of attuned to practice. Another sort of even broader point is sort of the life experience. A clerkship is typically, you go and work for 1-2 years if you're me and you like it so much. And you go and you live basically somewhere else. And, often if you're like me, you end up in Hawaii, you can end up somewhere, totally unexpected. So it's sort of an interesting way to kind of get out of your comfort zone and experience sort of just a different place. And there's truly just no better way to kind of get to know to get so intimately familiar with the litigation process than being behind the scenes and sort of seeing each aspect of a case, from the complaint being filed to the dispositive motion, or in other cases, all the way through to trial. So it really, I think, no matter what your ultimate goal is, it really is going to bring something positive to your professional goals.
I agree. I thought clerking was great. I clerked on a district court for a year, and it was probably the highlight of my limited legal, actual legal experience. No, it's great. You, like you said, you end up with a great mentor. Assuming that you're working for someone who, is nice. And yeah, it is so interesting just really seeing, what people are sending into court, like the quality of things that are coming across your desk, and then how this all works. It's one of those things where the judge might kind of turn to you and ask you for your opinion on an evidentiary issue in the middle of trial. So it definitely puts you on the spot and kind of makes you really, play your best game, because there's someone who's depending on you in a way that's actually, pretty important. But yeah, I thought it was fascinating. I highly recommend it. All right. Well, before we move on to a few scenarios, if people are interested in getting involved with Law Clerks for Diversity, either because they're aspiring clerks or they want to do mentors or be mentors, how can they do that?
So if people are interested in getting involved, they can. We're working on a website, so we're hoping to have that up and running at some point soon. But for now, we're sort of operating based on a Google document that is circulating. So the best way to find that is you can either follow us on Twitter. So our handle is @Clerks4Diversity, no E in clerks, and the number 4. Or anyone can just feel free to email us directly at lawclerks4diversity@outlook.com, and that's just all spelled out. So those are probably the best ways for now to contact us. You can also feel free to, add me on LinkedIn and send me a message. There's, however you want to get involved. And we can, I think, probably put these, hopefully in the information on the podcast as well.
Definitely. We'll drop the Twitter handle into the show notes. And if a website appears, we'll go back and update. So keep your eyes peeled, people. All right, great. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about a few scenarios related to the clerkship application process that you guys might have a bit of insight on. So the first one, So I'm doing well at a lower ranked law school and I really want to clerk, but my school just doesn't have a lot of infrastructure set up to help. What can I do to set myself up for success here?
So other than signing up for Law Clerks for Diversity, which is probably a good starting point at this moment, another good sort of starting point is to see if your school, I know you know part of the hypo is that there's not a big infrastructure, and I don't want to fight the hypo, but is to see if there is sort of maybe a bank or some way to figure out other alum from your school who have clerked, because a really good starting point can just be to find somebody who's willing to talk to you. And oftentimes, alum in particular are going to be really excited to help other alum find a clerkship. So whether there's sort of a method through your school to be able to do that, I know my school has just, again, a bank of all the alumni and, you know, their name and what judge they clerked for. So you could find somebody who sort of has do a little research on these people and call someone directly and see if they're willing to talk to you. So that's sort of one point. If that's not an option or you don't feel comfortable doing that, I think there is a lot online about clerking and about what it entails and about tips for what types of content to put in your cover letter, how to choose a writing sample. There are lots of blogs with people's personal stories. You just do a little bit of research. You should be able to find you'll hear a lot of different perspectives, but you might see something by someone that really sort of speaks to you, and maybe that person has a contact that you can just send them a message and say, I'm here, these are my grades from my first year of school, this is why I'm interested in clerking, would you be willing to talk to me? And in my experience, people really love to share their knowledge, and, creating this Law Clerks for Diversity program, we've had so much interest from current and former law clerks who just are really eager to share their knowledge and their networks with placing diverse candidates. So I think, it can seem a little bit scary, but sort of taking that step and just sending someone a message, go on to Twitter can honestly be a great resource. That's how actually Stephen and I connected. If you go on there, you can read through law Twitter and appellate Twitter. There's a lot of, sort of thoughts by current and former clerks as well.
Yeah, Lee and I, my business partner, actually met long ago on Twitter, although I'm not particularly active at this point. I think that's great advice. I mean, I definitely have had people reach out to me because they were interviewing with a judge that I had worked for, and I was always willing to talk to them. One of them, in fact, ended up clerking on the Supreme Court, so I was really happy for him. Impressive. I was like, that is probably because you have a lot of gumption and you will just reach out to people. I admired it. All right, moving on. So our next scenario. So I am a first generation college and law student, and people in my family don't really understand why I would want to take this lower paid job for a year or two when I could be working at a firm and making lots of money. Do you have any advice?
Yes, I think this is a classic sort of experience for those of us who don't come from families of lawyers and have to explain, what a law clerk is and why we're taking a job that, is only for 1 year. So I think sort of if the sort of first hurdle is just kind of explaining it to your family, I think sort of explaining, I always have a sort of end up having a more productive conversation when talking about clerking and explaining what I do to non-lawyers. Explain a little bit more about sort of what it is. So instead of just saying a law clerk, I mean, unfortunately, when you hear the word clerk, you kind of think, a lot of people will think of, administrative work. I think if you explain the type of work you'll be doing and why it's so useful right out of law school, that can be sort of a great way to explain to your family, sort of the skills you're going to learn by doing this. So, what a law clerk does is work one-on-one with judges who are deciding these really hard and really important cases that maybe you're reading about in the news. I mean, if your parents are following the news and see these kinds of judges being talked about and these interesting cases. Another thing to say is, if the sort of question was firm or clerking, after that year, if you plan to go back to a firm and you're going to tell your family, I intend to go back to a firm after this, but I'm going to do this for the year, you can tell them about the well-known law firm bonuses. So oftentimes you end up sort of paying yourself back if you, for 1 year take a lower salary and then you go back to a firm after your clerkship ends and you're not only setting yourself up to just have more options with a wider sort of pool of firms, but you're also setting yourself up to receive usually a pretty extraordinary bonus. So that's another way.
Exactly. I remember. Yeah. I remember getting that check. That was a pretty awesome day.
Yeah. So that's a language I think probably everyone is going to speak, no matter what their sort of history with law school or clerking or anything is. So yeah. So I think those are sort of, and I sometimes joke that, like, my parents, I sort of did it in a little backwards way, where I went to a law firm first, and my parents were excited that I had this, sort of long time career, and I was getting going as a associate, and I had been there for a few years, and then I said, well, it's been fun. I'm moving to Hawaii for a 1-year job. And so I kind of had to go through this as well. And, I'm very lucky. My parents have always been very supportive, and obviously they were thrilled about the location. But yeah, I think just sort of explaining what it does and sort of how it sets you up within the legal profession is sort of the best way to have those conversations with your family.
Yeah, and one thing people should know too is typically if you are working at a firm and then you go clerk, you actually make a higher salary. So it's kind of a trade-off in that. Do you get your bonus or do you get your higher salary?
Yeah, that's a really good point too. That makes me think to just remind people that, by clerking, typically when you return to a firm or when you go to a firm for the first time, depending on what you do, you basically get credit for that year that you clerked. So me right now, clerking for a few years, I wouldn't necessarily go back and restart as a third year. You kind of get that credit. So
right. That is also a great point. So maybe more flexibility than you realize. All right, next up. I'm getting ready to start law school. I'm excited about this podcast. I think clerking sounds great. How can I give myself the best shot at this when the time arrives?
So, you're already ahead of the game if you're thinking about it before law school. So that's great. I think this is going to be advice that you're, probably already hearing all over the place, and it's probably a little overwhelming and scary. But the easiest, most, effective thing to do as a incoming and or current 1L would be to just get the best grades that you possibly can, because it just is a fact that within this space, we're talking about students with higher grades getting clerkships. And so I won't sort of, beat that dead horse. I'm sure that's sort of getting talked about in every which way and as you enter law school. But another thing that I think is really important, and something that I think some of us who didn't know about the sort of clerkship opportunity, is to really get to know your professors, at least the ones that you sort of click with. If you're going to apply to clerkships eventually, you're going to need letters of recommendation. And at least one or two of those is going to need to be law professors, possibly, doctrinal law professors. So I think the best thing you can do, knowing you want to clerk as a 1L, is get to know professors and go to their office hours, talk to them about their experiences, tell them you're interested in clerking. And I think that's sort of one really good way to start. And then that also might lead to potentially your 2L or 3L year, potentially, research assistant opportunities, which are also going to be sort of a great way to set yourself up for clerking. You might end up getting sort of an interesting writing sample by doing things like that. And you're just, again, expanding that network. So those are the two, I think, big points I would make as a 1L. I think your job, it really should just be learning what law school is and sort of figuring out sort of how to navigate it and what works for you.
Yeah, I agree with both of those. I mean, I definitely had, a recommender who called the judge that I ended up working for. I mean, he told me that in the interview, and I was like, oh, I hope she said nice things. He's like, well, you are here, I was like, yeah, great. But I think those relationships are really, really important. And being a TA or research assistant for someone is a great way to really have them be able to speak to your working ability in a way that's different than your studying. And I think that's really valuable because obviously judges don't want to hire poorly. You're basically, as a judge, stuck with these people. And if they're not really good and not doing a great job, like you, are going to not have a very nice year.
Right. Absolutely.
So, they're normal people too. They're looking for someone that they can count on. Great. All right, our final scenario before we wrap up. I'm a non-white law student, and I just don't see a lot of clerks who look like me. is it worth it for me even to apply?
Yes, I think this is sort of, I think one of the obstacles I may have alluded to earlier, that's sort of a problem that we need to all be doing better at. The schools who are offering these resources, the judges who are doing the hiring. So yes, please don't be put off, and please apply. We need that sort of diversity of thought and background and experience. It's really going to only have a positive impact on our legal system, on the judiciary. And so, yes, I hope that those people will be encouraged to apply. And, as sort of, again, linking this back to the Law Clerks for Diversity idea, and sort of a few things I've mentioned throughout, is finding a strong mentor can really be so helpful in navigating the process. And as part of the Law Clerks for Diversity program, we hope to be able to sort of match people and create relationships that are based on sort of common backgrounds and experiences. So we hope that sort of those people will feel comfortable together. We don't see necessarily putting like a double Harvard person with somebody at a lower ranked school who might just do better off learning about how to navigate the law clerk process from somebody who had to deal with some of the obstacles that they're continuing to face today. So the answer is yes, and I hope people will be encouraged to apply so that we can do better in this one small space in the legal profession.
Right. It is a space that I think has disproportionate influence,
Absolutely.
which I'm not sure people necessarily fully comprehend initially, but it is one of those things that years later down the road will come back and like, well, they clerked for so-and-so. Even, people who are nominated as judges is like, well, they clerked for this person. It can end up being, a really much bigger deal than you think, like, whatever, I just worked for this person for a year. All right, great. We're about out of time. Before we close up, it doesn't sound like you necessarily had personal experience with this because you applied later, but what's going on with the Clerkship Hiring Plan these days? Is that even happening? I feel like every time I look, it's something else.
Yeah, that's right. It is always changing. So yeah, definitely do your research on this. But my understanding of the plan is that, several judges have opted into it, at least for this past year. But for those who are not familiar with it, basically, clerking has the sort of timeline for the clerkship hiring has changed over the years, and at various times there have been sort of attempts to kind of streamline everything and get everybody on the same page so that the timeline is sort of, I think at one point it was like one specific, when everybody was sort of following the same sort of plan, it was like one specific day and everybody would
it was crazy. That was
okay. Is that how it was for you? Yeah,
that was totally how it was. Like I remember, literally, it was insane because that day it was like at noon on this one particular day or whatever it was, judges could start scheduling interviews, and you'd applied a week before. And I remember I was in Fed Courts, which is like the total gunner class, and people started getting like messages on their cell phone at like 11:59. You just saw people like looking at their phones all around the room. It was really actually quite funny, but it was. Yeah, so everybody basically like got calls that time, and then you had a week, I think, before you could schedule. So then I was doing some interviews in the Southern District of New York, and it was like people were starting at like 6 a.m. And it was complete madness. Yeah. It's always complete madness, however they do it. But yeah, that was a particular brand of absolute madness.
Yeah, so I think it's not as I'm not sure it happens exactly like that anymore, especially because of these. There are some judges that follow the hiring plan, some that sort of just ignore it completely and do their own thing, some who sort of do a little mix. They kind of use it as a guide, but they're not married to it. But basically, my understanding right now is the idea, if you're following the hiring plan, it basically requires the judge to not review any applications until, I think, mid-June, and it has to be after someone's 2L year. So basically, the idea is to ensure that only people that have their 2 years of grades are being considered. And so the idea is, again, to preclude such early hiring of, someone who's, a 1L and, is taking space from people who are applying later. And it forces, each year it's sort of pushed the timeline that you have to apply even, earlier and earlier. And it's, as I mentioned before, law school is stressful enough. So that's the idea of it. And of course, as Alison, you mentioned, I was a graduate when I was applying. And so the hiring plan would not apply to me. So 3Ls or graduates can sort of be interviewed and hired whenever. So they would not fall within the hiring plan since we all obviously already have our 2 years of grades. I don't know what the percentages are as far as what judges follow it and what don't. But I will say that with more judges hiring, I think it's becoming more common for judges to hire at least one clerk with some work experience. So then that often will take one slot away by the time the hiring plan starts. But I think another part of the hiring plan that is really positive, and I hope a lot of judges think about at least adopting this policy, I don't know the exact, I think it requires maybe that the judges give 48 hours before they to have you respond to the offer. It used to be, and I think it probably still is with some judges, that they give what are called like exploding offers, which is basically, I give you the offer. Exactly. And you don't get to interview with anybody else. You don't get to think about it overnight. You don't get to go home and ask your spouse or whatever. So I think that's becoming, I'm hearing about that a lot less and less. This is totally anecdotal, but I'm just hearing about those kind of, and my experience was, my judges were both very, very kind and understanding. So my experience is that's less of a problem, but it's certainly out there. You hear these sort of other random stories of judges who are hiring as far out as like 2023, 2024. And it's just crazy. To think that, those people don't even have to be in law school yet.
That is really bizarre. Yeah, I think this is definitely one of these things where you need to find the most up-to-date information because it is moving all over the place and changing constantly. So, and again, that does just advantage the people who have these resources at their school, but that's not to say that you can't get this information yourself, for example, by having a nice mentor from Law Clerks for Diversity.
That's right.
All right, well, we are pretty much out of time, but any final thoughts you want to share with people?
I guess sort of one final thought, which your last point sort of made me think of is another sort of obstacle that diverse students face can also be sort of socioeconomic, sort of goes hand in hand with the lack of resources, is that, you mentioned that you were doing several interviews, various places, most judges, at least in pre-COVID times, had you fly to interview. And so it can be quite expensive to apply to clerkships. You're sort of expected to apply broadly. Some judges require only paper applications, which can become expensive if you're, printing, 50 paper applications and then mailing each one. And then the same sort of goes for having to get on a plane and fly to interview various places, especially if you have more than one interview. Some schools I think gives like small stipends for that, but not all do. So that's another sort of long-term goal that we hope to have more like sponsorship and other programs that might be able to offer more resources sort of from a financial perspective, because that is, I think, a really significant barrier to minorities, first-generation students from applying. So that's just one final point that your last discussion made me think of. But otherwise, I hope that people are as excited about sort of this initiative as we are. I think this is sort of a small thing that I think we feel excited that we can offer our own experiences with and sort of give back and share our networks and share our connections and let people know what worked for us, what didn't, and we hope that in a few years we start to hopefully see the impact.
That would be great, because I think it is a really amazing opportunity, and I think it should be spread more broadly. All right, well, with that, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Alison.
And unfortunately, we are now out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or allison@lawschooltoolbox.com, or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.